Perfect. So thanks a lot to the organizers for allowing me to come here for amazing skiing, but also for reading a really great paper. I really enjoyed reading it and learning a lot by doing so. And but I also need to disclose, actually, I think for 8 years I was drinking 3 times a week a coffee in Sam's office. So this might partially shape my views. So what is this paper about? So Sam did obviously a great job, as we all know when we've seen him present. It's about this common mistake that people tend to perceive dividends as free income. And if you read the Wall Street Journal or other kind of newspapers, you oftentimes hear that investors should in fact actually actively reach out and actually have kind of dividend-paying stocks in their portfolios. Now, I didn't open my preferred MBA textbook, but hopefully Jonathan actually doesn't actually say something very similar in his kind of monumental work. But this is a very common kind of wisdom that, it seems that free dividends is kind of this common fallacy, and potentially that can in fact be very, very costly, as we've seen all from Sam's and Dave's previous work. So the paper at hand now shows us that actually in fact a very simple intervention implemented via RCT embedded in the survey can actually change people's behavior. What I really like, and I'll come back to that at the very end, is actually that this effect seems to be really, really long lasting, which is kind of not very common maybe in this kind of literature. The evidence is most consistent with an educational channel, and so I would say this paper ticks all boxes. Not only is the bank happy, but of course also the authors can be really proud. It's an important question. It's great data, and the results are really convincing. Nevertheless, of course, as a discussant, I need to poke a few things. So let's maybe get started. So maybe it's just kind of a cheap shot. So of course, it could be very plausible that you use dividends to buy some nice stuff, maybe a skiing trip to Utah, in which case, of course, maybe you could say, well, that's maybe suboptimal if you would compare that to optimal consumption savings decision. But maybe, I would actually put the money into a different account to save for college tuition for my kids. Now, college in Germany is free, so that's maybe an unlikely example. But, just kind of to say that, maybe we would need to think a little bit more kind of what the welfare kind of implications are. I think given that we have this evidence that it's a role of information, most likely we can rule out all those other things, but maybe it's kind of useful to stress this a little bit more. Now, related to this previous point, and again here maybe it's just about kind of making it clear for a reader that is not familiar with the German banking market. But if you think about your typical US bank customer, so I don't even have a wallet anymore, but I have always credit cards from 3 different companies in my cell phone. So therefore, maybe the saving of dividends happens actually in a different account, exactly for the alternatively purposes that I was referring to. Now, of course, as I alluded to, Germans are special. We don't have many banks. We typically have only one house bank. There's survey evidence that the average German has a little bit less than 1.5 banking relationships. Again, it's a very unlikely mechanism, but I think, just to tell the reader that actually kind of is not familiar with the German banking structure and market, that's maybe not too relevant. Now, as I said, Germans, of course, as you supposedly it seems all agree, of course, special, but, Germans kind of are definitely different from the average audience here in the room. It's 14% of the average German population that invests directly in stocks. The very German bank that Sam and co-authors cooperate with is also special. I actually still have a pocket money account with that bank. But typically, it's kind of higher income and higher education customers that are living in big cities, and typically not in Eastern Germany, but also, as Sam already alluded to, the German firms are special in the sense that they have this one big dividend in the spring. So just kind of make sure that referees don't come up with a cheap shot saying, well, look, that's all about Germany, and we cannot really learn anything about maybe other markets we might be interested in. I think you can just easily address that in the paper. Okay, so did I move too far? Let's see. Yes, so the authors actually do a great job in terms of designing the treatment. But if you think about it, and you saw it in this presentation, the treatment, if you think about it, has kind of 2 parts. The first one is an explanation about the dividend policy. And the second one is, if you actually don't reinvest dividends, you might be, relatively speaking, poor compared to reinvesting. So are people kind of reacting to the educational aspect, or is it like I see big returns and that's why I'm reacting to? Now you might say, well, isn't it at the end of the day the same thing? I think this is really crucial to disentangle, because ultimately, if you want to bring it to different settings and say, well, look, you can teach investors something about potential mistakes, if they only kind of react to big returns and not to the educational intervention. And I think some of the heterogeneity tests Sam was alluding to at the end allow them to disentangle that, but I think discussing that directly in the paper would be useful. Related to that, so of course, the total effect of the treatment is kind of very plausible and convincing. But the question is this a reaction to the treatment alone, or is also other stuff going on? So this morning, Brian was alluding to maybe, there are certain narratives, mental models, other expectations that do shift in response of the treatment, and to the extent the authors have elicited other expectations after the treatment, you could potentially kind of directly rule it out. Now, I learned that maybe not reinvesting dividends is kind of a big deal, but then maybe I want to kind of learn a bit more about it, so I start searching the internet. Maybe I ask ChatGPT, and actually that's partially undoing the treatment of the authors. But so I would kind of like to see potentially ways to rule it out, or potentially also have that as part of the mechanism in the paper. For example, I'm pretty sure the authors could get data on kind of like meetings with bank advisors and things like that to potentially look into that. Now, I was wondering a bit kind of like what the normative takeaways are. Should we just do more informational campaigns? Plausibly. But then the question is, who should be the messenger? Should it be like an academic, like the survey stated in the subject line, that it's a survey in cooperation with Goethe University in Frankfurt? Or should it purely be the bank? And if so, is then the concern that maybe customers will think, well, the bank is trying to push business on us, and maybe might actually not react to it? Or maybe, in fact, actually offering automatic reinvestment plans is the way to go. Maybe the bank is already doing that. This would be kind of super, super neat to show that. Now, Sam was already showing a little bit in terms of like subsequent actions, but given that they find this strong evidence that the dividend yield post-intervention, in fact, is moving and in fact is slower, I think, I would want to just understand a bit more how this is happening. Do I now kind of like just change a little bit kind of like my automatic kind of like allocation for my monthly paycheck and buy less dividend paying stocks? Do I actively rebalance my portfolio? How do realized returns in fact actually differ of the different groups? All that type of stuff I think would be really kind of useful and interesting. Now, I didn't have a better way of titling it. Is it learning or learning? And what I mean by that, so like Sam and co-authors like this have this clever insight in saying, well, we can rule out that people previously rationally consumed dividends, because if they had, they wouldn't react to our information. Now, I can totally see, and I've written similar statements in papers like mine also before, so that's why I think it's likely true. But you could, of course, also come up with an alternative mechanism. Maybe previously, I was really uncertain. If you think about a Bayesian learning model, I have really tight wide priors, and then I get information, and I might actually reconsider my previous behavior and think, well, if the bank is saying that, and even Goethe University, well, maybe even if I actually consume dividends rationally, that must have been suboptimal, and as a result, potentially react. Now, I'm not saying that it's kind of the most plausible straw man, but I'm just kind of like suggesting a little bit of rewriting. One thing that maybe Sam actually hadn't mentioned in the paper, so you do see differential response rates in the different information treatment groups, placebo versus actual treatment. And in general, I think actually the authors can be really happy with the response rate. The type of service the bank runs oftentimes has a response rate of 2%. So that's actually already on the higher end. But nevertheless, actually, I would like to see a little bit more discussion on what could potentially drive the differential response rate. Now, Sam actually mentions that they have a differential length of the treatment invitation in the survey email. Now, that's most likely indeed the reason why people didn't participate in the survey, because if you see the super long text, maybe actually you don't finish it. But then, of course, it could also be that maybe the people that did read the very long text of the dividend invitation email are more diligent. Of course, all Germans are diligent, but maybe they are even more diligent. And so, that could be, of course, one concern in terms of interpreting treatment effects. And so given that the authors have actually the response time, you could just see, on average, do people spend more time in the actual treatment group relative to the placebo treatment group for similar type of questions, and that would actually allow them to rule that out. Now, something I think, as a discussant, I should at least mention, if you look at the year prior to the information treatment, and you look at the reinvestment sample in, red, versus the placebo treatment in pinkish or, purple, you do see like there's a differential, at least in terms of point estimate, kind of reinvestment in the weeks around the dividend payment in the year before. Now, the reason why I think that potentially is relevant is the following story. So now imagine you kind of know, I typically eat all my dividends, and maybe I have already kind of a gut feeling, maybe that's not ideal. So then I get this email that says, well, it's a survey about kind of learning about dividends. Then I click on it. I read, well, actually, I get taught something by academics and my bank on what to do with the dividends. And then actually, I think, well, maybe I did a mistake. I read it. I actually live according to it. So indeed, it's a treatment to a change in behavior due to the survey. But of course, I might then also gather more information outside of the treatment, and maybe that information acquisition had also happened if the survey was not in place. Now, again, I'm not saying that's the most plausible explanation given the strength of the treatments, but given that you see this differential prior dividend reinvestment, I think at least you should actually discuss that a little bit more in the paper. Now the clicker again, stop. So briefly coming to actually the empirical results on dividend reinvestment, we saw very strong, big, and significant effects in the dividend season. If you now would, however, separate the main dividend season and the minor dividend payments, not all German firms only pay dividends once a year, you would actually see that outside of the main dividend season, the effects are substantially smaller. Now, of course, it's totally consistent with dividend payments being smaller, less salient, you don't pay so much attention to it. But it's also the case that there's a larger gap between the survey intervention and when those kind of smaller dividends are paid. Now, of course, the long-run effects of the treatment would rule out that the smaller treatment effects are because of that. But then if I really learned that consuming dividends is not a good thing, why do I then still consume it in the minor seasons, or do I just simply kind of not pay attention and the money accumulates in the account? If you actually could see if the dividends kind of go into the checking account or so of the consumers and it just kind of sticks around there, I think this would be useful. You also kind of see in the data that the effects tend to be larger, as we saw in Sam's presentation for the placebo, in one of the results for the placebo group relative to the zero touch group. Now, previously we saw in the year prior that the zero touch group had a larger dividend reinvestment. So is it then the case that you have some form of mean reversion in the placebo, or did maybe some of the texts in the placebo treatment trigger larger dividend consumption? It's just a little bit kind of better kind of laying out what potentially might be going on is useful. Now, it's just one thing, why I think actually this persistence of the treatment effect is so cool. In a totally different setting, so you do information provision experiment on inflation, even less people care about than maybe about dividends, but you see also on impact, so column 1 and 2, large negative coefficient, that means people react a lot. Then you look what happens after 3 months, the coefficient is a third of the size. That simply, I want to say, you tell people stuff, they tend to forget. Now, it's not only you tell them in survey stuff, you tell them actually objective news. You tell them what the Fed inflation target is. And after 3 months, 2/3 of that information is gone. After 6 months, they fully forget about it. Now, that's why I think actually telling people something about dividends is really, really cool, because it seems to actually trigger some active change in behavior even 2 years out. Now, one thing, however, I would also kind of like to at least see a little bit discussed is this idea that maybe the degree of attention and the degree of learning could be state dependent. And so again, I don't have time to explain this plot, but effectively all I want to tell you is there's a gap between 2 lines, until 2020. This means that people were really misinformed, and then the gap shrinks. That means that people are really informed in high inflation times what the prevailing inflation rate is. You also see large negative point estimates for treatment effects. That means people learn a lot, consistent with them being misinformed. Instead, in high inflation times, consistent with them being informed, you tell them simple statistics about inflation, they don't react to that at all. This is just to indicate that, in those type of learning settings, you learn about stuff that you previously are not informed, totally consistent with kind of the results of Sam's paper. But you also see that the degree of learning is state dependent, depends on the macroeconomic environment. Now, one of the kind of common conventional wisdoms, as I was alluding to at the beginning, is this idea that you especially should invest in dividend-paying stocks during kind of recessionary times, 2020, 2021. Now, again, I think it's a bit far-fetched, but is it the case that the result of the treatment is maybe different outside of that period because unconditionally people already hold less dividend-paying stocks, maybe also because like in that time they paid special attention to certain things. So anyways, all I'm saying is like, given that you have the data also from the period kind of like 2019 and previously, like it would be useful to kind of like also benchmark this against that. Now Lubo starts looking at me, so like, let me just kind of skip the random rants and directly kind of go to the conclusion. I just can reiterate it's a great paper, and most of the things I said are pretty much just rewriting or maybe some suggestion for future work. And let me stop here. Thank you.